You ever gone hunting? I mean real hunting. Deep hunting. I'm not trying to gatekeep the hobby or anything, but there are two different types of hunting, you know? There's driving your ATV out to a deer blind and waiting for 12 hours. Then, there's spending a week in the woods. 2 weeks, or more. There's the kind of hunting where you become a part of your surroundings. You become another one of the animals. You don't have to hold your breath and cover your scent from the top of some tower. You're on the ground. You're in it. You don't have to hide from it any more than it hides from you. Sooner or later, you start to see just how much the woods can hide. I think that's what drew me to it initially, those long hunts in the woods. I like to learn about the things the world had hidden from me. I like to see them up close. They didn't like to see me much. I learned that the hard way. I was on my 6th day in a familiar stretch of the woods, right at the base of a mountain. I liked returning to my old hunting grounds every few years. This was one of those locations. I liked coming back to see what had changed. There was always a shift in the flora and fauna, even if it was only minuscule. Took me a while to see it sometimes. That wasn't the case on this trip. I knew right away that things were different. There wasn't a jay or waxwing to be heard. In fact, all of the woods were quiet. I didn't know what that meant until the 6th day. On that day, I had my first sighting. There were prints outside my camp. They didn't circle the supplies I had suspended 100 feet away. They circled my tent. The prints were big, too. Big enough that I almost mistook them as human. There were a few tracks in the soft earth, though, that were unmistakably canine. The animal must have been dragging one of its legs, creating a longer print. That's what I told myself anyway. I figured it was wounded or sick. I thought it might offer me an explanation. It might tell me why the woods were so quiet. Was the large wolf scaring the rest of the animals away? I was determined to see it up close, in the flesh. I was determined to hunt that beast, especially since it dared wandered so close to where I slept. On night 7, I didn't sleep. I waited, and it arrived. Leaves crunching beneath the weight of something told me which way to look. I saw its silhouette approach first, from outside the dim light of my camp. I thought I saw a man approaching. I raised an arm and lowered my gun. I said hello and waited for a reply. Instead, the shape froze just beyond the perimeter of my vision. I squinted, tried to make out who it was. Then the creature dropped down to all fours, and I recognized it immediately. I don't know how I could have mistaken it for a human being when it was so clearly a wolf, the largest I'd ever seen. I had to bring my rifle back up quickly. It was running toward me, running in an indirect and unpredictable path. I missed my shot. The bullet grazed its side instead of sinking into its chest. That was going to cost me. With every step the beast took, its unkempt claws tore up the earth, tipped dirt out in a path behind it, tracing the zigzag route it had carved from the trees. I could smell it by then. It burned my nostrils. Wet fur and sulfur. Its hair was thick but matted to its body, so tightly clumped together that I could still make out the muscular shape of its body. I wondered briefly if it had hunted the forest to extinction, all on its own. I would have believed it if somebody told me yes. I managed to fire again. I don't know where the second bullet hit. I only remember the creature howling. It leapt into my direction. I barely managed to shove off its attack and turn my gun sideways, and using it as a barrier. There was red in its fur. I knew it was bleeding. That second shot had saved me. It was the reason the creature was so weak. The wolf still managed to wrestle the rifle out of my hands as it jerked its head away and pulled my weapon with it. I rushed toward my tent. There was a small axe inside, used to trim firewood and cut through the brush. I could feel its breath behind me. I could imagine its long teeth sinking into my neck. I pushed through the flap of the tent just in time. I imagined its claws tearing through the fabric just behind me, barely missing my head. I scurried, retrieved the axe, and rolled onto my back, expecting the animal to be there. I could still smell the odor. I could still hear its ragged breathing. I just knew its face would be peering through the tent's entrance. But it wasn't there. The tent flap was splayed open, revealing the scene outside, grass and dirt. I could see my gun laying on the ground nearby, but there was no sign of the creature. It had left quickly as it came, I guess. My hunt was over. Those woods hadn't welcomed me back. They'd turned me away, and I wasn't going to ignore their warnings. I gathered my things and was gone within the hour. Only when the sun broke, and I finally heard a bird calling in the distance, did I feel safe at all. For one reason or another, the wolf had spared me. I won't be going back to those woods. And whether you're in the blind or down in the mud with the animals, when the forest goes quiet, remember that you're still not alone. Every strange encounter starts out different, doesn't it? The details never quite seem to match from one person to another. Sometimes the thing they encounter is vicious. Other times, it's peaceful. Sometimes it stalks them from the trees, and sometimes it runs away. I think that's why the stories get so hard to believe. So very few of them get the details right. They never match. That's the issue for me anyway. Nobody else's story matches mine. Nobody's seen what I saw. Not exactly. Nobody's suffered in the exact way that I have either. That made it easy to convince myself that I'd simply lost my mind. I guess at a point. However, you learn to separate your nightmares from your memories. I know what I remember, and I'll tell anybody who listens. Eventually, maybe, someone else's story will sound like mine. Together, at least in the way I picture it. The world will start to consider our tales to be closer to the truth than deceit. If that day ever comes, maybe believing it will make me feel better. Like I said, I've suffered enough already. It wasn't long after I became a newlywed that I also became a parent. It was tough on us. Kids always start tough. I think. We were tired, frustrated, and vulnerable. Part of me thinks that they jumped on that. That vulnerability made us the perfect specimens. That's what we were. You see, when the air around us started to hum, and the house shook around us, we were their specimens. We were rats in a glass cage. It started randomly. The buzzing in the air was like an alarm had gone off somewhere. We couldn't hear it, but we could feel it. Then the house started to rumble. We jumped out of bed, ran for the baby. When the lights began to flood in through our windows, I ran outside. I wanted to know who was terrorizing us. I wanted to show them that we weren't afraid. When my bare feet hit that grass, however, I was very afraid. A dark spherical craft hovered above our home. A single floodlight poured out from its center, washing across our lawn. It fixated on me, like the gaze of some great astral eye. I froze in that beam of light. Whatever that craft was, it didn't have engines. It didn't have any windows for the pilots to peer out of. It was a single solid sphere, and it froze me, there on the lawn. It trapped me like a spider's web. The light consumed my vision. I couldn't see a thing except for that white glow. I couldn't feel anything except for the hum of this mysterious vessel. It shook me all the way to my bones. I could feel them vibrating. My teeth rattled in their sockets. When the light faded and the humming stopped, the craft was gone. It took my mind a minute to realize that the light I was looking at then was, in fact, the light of the sun. The night had ended. I wondered if I had stood there in the yard for the hours between the encounter and the sunrise. When I walked inside my home, I realized that it was worse. My spouse began screaming. They hadn't seen me in days, they said. I was a missing persons case, they explained. I didn't believe them. How could I? I stood in the light for minutes, and entire days were now gone. But everything they said tracked. The date, the police involvement. There was proof of all of it. How do you rebuild trust after something like that? I couldn't explain where I'd gone. They believed me, I know, but they didn't want to. Our marriage fell apart. It was better that way, I know, but it was still impossible to process. I saw my child for a while after that, but then the ship returned. It came for me again. I realized in the second encounter that it wasn't visiting our house that night. The vessel had come for me, and now it had returned. This time I knew better. I stayed out of the light, but its appearance confirmed something for me. I was a danger to anyone I kept close. How could I let someone else be sucked in the same mystery that had ruined my life? My routine became a cycle of doctors and disbelief. I became a warning for the rest of my town. They called me a drunk, a disappointment, or a victim. The name didn't matter. What mattered is that the ship forced them to do that. The ship forced me into solitude, and alone is where I remain. There's no suffering like being alone, is there? It's the worst fate I can imagine. I would have preferred to stay in the light forever. At least then, ignorance would be on my side. Now, I live in fear. I cry at night if the house shakes, just slightly. Bad weather or a strong wind is enough to remind me of the thing I'm hiding from. Not that I could ever escape it. 5 times I've seen the vessel. I'm sure I'll see it again before my time is up. But what does it want from me? Why does it insist on keeping me isolated? What distinguishes me from the rest of the rats? No other encounter goes like this. Not that I've heard. Most happened once and then never again. Mine seems more like a forever kind of deal. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this sounds familiar to you. Maybe my story's given you a little bit of deja vu. Why don't you tell me? Has anyone else felt the hum in their bones? Has anyone else seen the light? Has anyone else lost days, bathed in the mystery of some astral visitors? I know the answer. It just hurts to hear. For now, I guess I'll continue what I've done. I'll remember and wait for someone who believes. Let me tell you about the time I was visiting my dear old mother in her small little house out in the countryside. You see, my mom's house is a small little cottage located on the edge of a really dense forest. It's kind of the place where you can really connect with nature and forget about all the troubles and stresses of our modern world. But things weren't quite the same as they used to be. You see, my father had just passed away, and now my mom was living alone. It was a tough time for her, and I wanted to do everything I could to help her feel less alone. So I packed my bags and headed out to the countryside for a couple of weeks, ready to spend some serious one-on-one quality time with my mom and help her grieve and get back in touch with nature. As I pulled up to her house, the pain of my father's absence hit me pretty hard. He was a really good man, but I put on a brave face and went inside, ready to spend some time with my mom. As we caught up and talked about old times, I got all nostalgic, and I felt like I was 20 years younger. There were our old family photos on the walls, and the familiar smell of my mom's delicious cooking. It all brought back memories of a simpler time. It was delightful, and I could tell we both needed this time together. And so I spent the next couple of weeks with my mom, enjoying the peace and quiet of the countryside. But eventually, it was time for me to head back to the city. As I said goodbye to my mom and hugged her tightly, I was incredibly grateful for the time we had spent together. I was in a great mood, and I was heading to my car when I saw something scurrying under my car. I figured it was probably a cat or a possum or something, since there were all kinds of wildlife around my mom's house. But as I got down on all fours and flashed a light under the car, I saw the most horrifying thing I had ever laid my eyes upon. Looking back at me was an absolutely hideous creature with green skin, pointed ears, and long, gnarled fingers. Its eyes glowed red in the reflection of the flashlight, and it had these ugly, long yellow sharp teeth. I absolutely could not believe what I was seeing, and I freaked out and jumped back and fell onto the ground. The freakish green little freak screeched at me and bared its teeth and lunged right at me. It moved with a strange, jerky motion, like its joints were made of rubber. Its skin was covered in warts and boils, and it reeked like the smell of rotten garbage. The thing climbed on top of my chest, and its long, bony fingers gripped tightly around my throat. It let out this crazed, maniacal laugh as it started choking me. I fought back with everything I had. I started punching the evil monster right in its face as hard as I could, desperately trying to grasp for air. Finally, I got a good hit right on its temple, and I was able to push it off my chest. It let out an angry scream and took off toward the woods. I sat there on the ground with my hand around my chest, still in shock as I realized how close to death I came. As the creature disappeared back into the woods, I could hear its deranged laughter again, and I didn't know how to mentally process what had just happened to me. I stumbled inside and told my mom what had just happened to me outside. She didn't even skip a beat before saying, "It's those damn goblins again. I've seen them around here before. They're always causing trouble." I was in total disbelief. I couldn't believe what was coming out of her mouth. Freaking goblins. Really? This is the 21st century, for God's sake. But the more she talked about them, the more I realized that my mom was dead serious. She told me about how they were mischievous little creatures that lived deep in the forest and only came out at night to wreak havoc on anyone and anything they could get their nasty, grubby little hands on. Apparently, these goblins were causing all sorts of trouble around the neighborhood. They would steal food from people's houses, vandalize their property, and make all sorts of creepy noises in the middle of the night. My mom even had an encounter with one of the little devils herself. She told me how one night she woke up to the sound of something scratching at her bedroom window. She got up to investigate and was shocked to see a nasty little green goblin peering in at her through the glass. She said the creature had these beady little eyes and this twisted, evil grin on its face. My mom tried to shoo it away, but the goblin was just laughing and continued to scratch at the window. It wasn't until my mom grabbed a kitchen knife that it jumped down from the window and took off back into the forest. It was all just so surreal. I mean, I always thought the goblins were something you read about in fairy tales or saw in movies. But now, here I was, freshly attacked by a goblin and hearing first-hand accounts of these little monsters running amok in the countryside. On my way home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. It made me realize that everything I thought I knew about the world was a lie. If freaking goblins could exist, then who's to say that ghosts, aliens, Bigfoot, all of that stuff couldn't exist too? It was a bizarre moment in my life, like this huge veil had been lifted from my eyes. Then I was seeing the world in a whole new way. I didn't know what to make of it, but one thing's for sure, I'll never look at the world the same way